Old Northfield, a window on our history. This program has been prepared to give you a glimpse of Old Northfield. Northfield Township was the name given to Town 11, Range 5 of the Western Reserve in 1819. That includes the communities we know today as Northfield Center, Northfield Village, Macedonia, and Sagamore Hills. The Historical Society of Old Northfield invites you to join me in looking through this window at our local history. Hello, I'm Paul Nelson, one of the members of the Historical Society, and I'll be your guide for this journey back in time. Looking out of any window, one quickly sees a wide array of people, places, and things. We're using the camera lens as our window as we visit yesteryear and look at some of the people, places, and things of Old Northfield. Time restraints will allow us to focus only on the highlights, but I hope this whets your appetite to find out more about the community in which you live. And so, let us take a look at some of the people and some of the places of Old Northfield, like this sugar house. By the way, did you know that Summit County was once one of the largest producers of maple syrup in Ohio? This sugar house was on the Dresser farm, which later became part of the Long Estate in Macedonia. And finally, some of the things of Old Northfield, like this train. This train is shown here rushing northward over the railroad tracks, which today is part of State Route 82. It's a great big world we live in, and a mention of Old Northfield doesn't generate an instant image in the greater scheme of things, except for those of us who call this our home. One quickly forms a pretty comprehensive mental picture when seeing a scene like this of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. But when one sees a scene of Old Northfield, it takes a little more explanation. Hopefully, by the end of this program, you will have a better understanding of this, our community. But where do we start? Well, about 12,000 years ago, we were all under a mile of ice, under the Great Ice Age. The Ice Age slowly began to dissipate and left us with the Great Lakes Basin. I don't think the lighthouse was there when the ice melted. That probably was a later addition. And when the Ice Age melted, it also left us with bountiful lands and less lush vegetation. Fast forwarding, we find ourselves at the end of the 1700s as part of the Northwest Territory and the lands of the Western Reserve of Connecticut. By 1796, a private land company acquired all that land east of the Cuyahoga River. Moses Cleveland, the general agent of the Connecticut Land Company, and two others arrived here and set up a base of operations on the Cuyahoga. By October 1st, they had laid out 220 lots in that city which would eventually bear the name of Moses Cleveland. I'm sure Moses had no idea what that city would look like some 200 years later. Moses left never to return again, but Alonzo Carter arrived in 1797 and became the first settler. By February 19, 1803, Congress declared the eastern portion of the Northwest Territory to be the state of Ohio. The early survey parties also laid out the remaining countryside and arranged it into a series of towns. And our piece of that geography, as we see here, is called Range 5, Town Number 11, and covered about 27 square miles. It was 1806, and Isaac Bacon of Boston bought 160 acres of land in Town 5. He selected lot number 63 and left his home in New England, making his way across New York State, then down through the Alleghenies, and eventually arriving at the mouth of the Cuyahoga. He made his way down the river towards what we now know as Valley View Road. Perhaps the traffic was not as bad in those days as it is today. He would arrive at this site and make his way up the hill and settle at Locust Bend, building his cabin on the site of this house as it was pictured some 50 years ago. This location is on Valley View Road and still is known as Locust Bends. Isaac Bacon's early neighbors were the Indians and a whole collection of wild animals, including bear and fox. Shortly thereafter, Jeremiah Cranmer, Bacon's brother-in-law, arrived and settled on the site of this century house at North Boyden and Valley View Road. Town 5 was on its way to becoming a viable settlement. And names like Snatchpenny, Little York, Brandywine, Northfield Center, and Macedonia would become part of our history. This then was Old Northfield. Having set the scene, let's join Perry Leach and some of his friends for a wagon ride around Town 5. In case the weather turns bad, there are plenty of sleighs in the community, like this one dated in a photo from 1890. Perhaps one of the new automobiles like this one, owned by the Seidel's, might help us get around a little quicker. But then we've heard there may be some difficulties with this new contraption. This is an example of a photo being worth 1,000 words, and I'm sure each of you could add your own caption to this wonderful scene. And when did the four communities of today evolve, you ask? Here are the facts. Listen carefully now, there'll be a test at the end of the program. In 1819, Town 5, the entire 27 square miles, became Northfield Township. The area around Brandywine Falls was annexed from Boston Township to the south, accounting for that irregular boundary on the southern border. In 1905, the settlement around Tinker's Creek at the state road separated to become the village of Macedonia. It later grew, and in 1912, Macedonia became a township, and in 1970, Macedonia became a city. Meanwhile, in 1912, the remaining land after Macedonia separated became Northfield Village. In 1932, Sagamore Hill separated from Northfield Village to become a township, changed to a village in 1943, and back to a township again in 1947. That accounts for the current roadside signs which says the township was formed in 1947. But in reality, Sagamore Hills became a political entity and a township in 1932. Continuing, in 1935, Northfield Center separated from Northfield Village to become a township, leaving the small remaining area as Northfield Village. With the exception of a few small annexations, the area has not changed since then. One note we should make: the area on the east side of Macedonia came from part of Twinsburg Township, a result of the fact that the Dell School District of Macedonia covered that area. As we make our tour around Old Northfield, we see that farming was common to all parts of the community. Here, typical residents like Perry Leach, George Ockenpaw, and Walter Beanie are trying out a new plow. Farming was the principal means of earning a living for most residents, and a necessity as well. It remained that way well until after World War II. Crops like wheat at 30 bushels an acre, oats at 55 bushels an acre were common. Rye was also a common crop. Corn was the first crop, It was feed for livestock and then was used as mash for the distillery that was eventually built at Brandywine. Sites like this were common in the township, like this early scene of haying. And then later, the steam-powered thresher was used, often moving from farm to farm and requiring usually 3 men to operate. Dairying was one of the chief industries in the town. We were a large cheese producer and shipped a great deal of it to the outside world, first by canal and later by railroad. A typical cash crop, such as this of raising ducks or geese for market, was common, like this one here on the Seidel farm, which today would be found on Meadowbrook off Brandywine. And another typical cash crop, raising a few pigs for a winter supply of meat, but also it would add a few dollars if some of this were also sold to the general community. We indeed were an agrarian community. As we continue our trip around the old township, we'll focus on the boundaries of today's communities that will help you identify where perhaps some of these scenes are located. Of course, Northfield Center was indeed the center of the old original township. And this is an early scene, somewheres between 1879 but before 1895. Remember that photographs are really only a product of the late 1800s, and before that, illustrations took the form of line drawings or sketches. In this early photo, if you look carefully, we are looking down Old 8. On the left, you will see the town hall, built in 1848. And in the distance, you can see the brick school, built in 1879. The building in the foreground is a warehouse from the old cheese factory, but it too had seen many other applications. It started out as part of the Presbyterian Church from 1833 to 1871, located on the site of the current Northfield Library. And of course, the early pump, which was found in the community in 1825, still stands there today, a remnant of the days gone by. We see here an early view of the cheese factory, the Lyons Cheese Factory, from a line drawing of the Summit County Atlas of 1872. The site was later bought by George Bishop with a store and dwelling that he added that would face Brandywine Road. We're looking to the north, towards the junction at Northfield Center. A post office was located in this building. And here we see Mrs. Leach crossing the street, coming from the other side where it is reported that she had a cow and other livestock. Down Brandywine Road on the east side stood the old Methodist Church on what was the original Stanley Farm property. It was gone by 1920, and eventually a house replaced it, where today an arts and crafts store and house exists. The Stanley homestead, which was part of that old farm, burned in 1924, leaving only the fireplace chimney. That, of course, you will recognize as part of St. Barnabas today, and you will see that as part of the outside altar. By 1895, the ABC interurban line had been completed. ABC stood for Akron, Bedford, and Cleveland, and was part of that interurban line that ran all the way from Akron up through Bedford and eventually to downtown Cleveland. Here we see the waiting room on the northeast side of the square, and in the background, the old Presbyterian church. The ABC car here can be seen headed southbound on Old 8. We're looking to the north. You can see the mud road, which was part, then of what we now know as Old 8. The Bliss home can be seen in the background, the white building, and also the building to the extreme right was the 8 and 82 Tavern, now probably known best as the veterinarian's office. The platform we see here was for Perry Leach's store. The interurban would bring mail, express, and would even pick up and deliver milk, in addition to carrying passengers over its route. The official name for the interurban later was known as the Northern Ohio Traction Company. For you streetcar buffs, here's a better look at one of those early ABC cars, where it waits at Miles and Broadway on its way towards Cleveland. It was a Washington sash car built by the Coolman Manufacturing Company of Cleveland, Ohio. A little further down Old 8 was the old high school of Northfield. It was the brick building built for identical schools both in Northfield and in Macedonia. And if you look carefully to the right, you can see the old frame schoolhouse that existed there before the brick school was built. Let's pause for just a moment while we look back again at an early map of Old Northfield Center. In 1819, the first election was held and Northfield Township was created. Its name was probably taken from Northfield, Massachusetts, reflecting the heritage of Isaac Bacon. In 1825, a log school was built on the square. We're not exactly sure where, but probably where the bandstand now stands. By 1827, 47 residents could be counted in the township. And by 1832, the first houses and stores appeared in the center. Hezekiah Palmer built the first house. In 1834, Milton Arthur built the first store, probably on the site where the Northfield Center Town Hall is today. But there were few customers, and they had little money. In 1835, the frame school we mentioned just a few moments ago, standing next to that brick school, replaced the log school. And in 1837, Northfield Center had a post office in the Lily House, where the McConnell farm was, and close to where the town hall is today. In 1840, the park in the square was created, with each property owner on each of the corners giving 1/4 acre for the creation of that public square and park. The frame school eventually was moved from the east side of the road to the west side of the road, and can be seen here after it was no longer used as a schoolhouse. It would be on the site of where the folk block was eventually built, which we know today as the red block where Brandywine Antiques is located. In the background, you can still see the old town hall. The folk block was built about 1925. We're moving forward here. And this was built as a store and multiple other uses, including a post office and eventually part of the telephone exchange. This would be looking up and down Old North, probably during rush hour. Probably just a little bit different today than in those days. I don't see any traffic lights there at the corner. Here we are looking to the east on State Road, which of course today we know as State Route 82 or Aurora Road. You can still see the old town hall at the right-hand side of the picture, and you can see the interurban tracks crossing the State Road. Boy, wouldn't the commuters give their eye teeth for having traffic like that today. Eventually, the town hall was abandoned. It became part of a garage and eventually a shell station. You can still see part of the old park because the town hall and the station sat quite a ways back from the intersection. The intersection of the roadway has been widened considerably over the years. This is an early view looking to the west from Public Square. The church to the right, of course, is the Federated Church, or the Presbyterian Church as it later was known, the one that eventually was moved down to South Boyden Road. You can see the frame shed in the back where horses would be stored while the parishioners were attending church. And then, of course, the building on the other side was the Orrin Bishop House, later known as the Halfway House, the Washington Inn, and even later known as the Bliss House. It dates back to 1839 and eventually was demolished for the inevitable gas station in 1961. Here's another view looking to the west with the Bishop House, or the Halfway House. If you look carefully to the left of this picture, you can see the town hall. The town hall here is shown before the addition was added to the right for the fire station in about 1927. The town hall was originally built in 1909. Another view of the Halfway House, or Washington Inn. You can see the trees have grown a little bit more, but the road still looks about the same. An early view of the Federated Church as it stood on the square. A little later view, again showing some of the trees as they have begun to grow in the area. This was the Seidel House on Route 82. This would be just west of where the Farmer Boy restaurant is today. That building still exists. Going to the north on Old 8, this would have been the Palmer House. The Palmer House was built in 1844, and you can still see the summer kitchen, which would be on the right-hand side of the house. The house itself was moved a little bit to the north when the grade school was built, and of course you would recognize this school today because it still stays and looks about the same, except for the additions that have been added to it. By the way, there were some temporary classrooms that were added to that building back shortly after it had been built in the late 1920s. Across the street and down Leonard Avenue was the old post office with one of those infamous Studebakers parked out in front. Remember the Studebaker? You couldn't tell whether it was coming or going. In this picture, we'll leave that up to you. You can decide whether it's coming or going. That building still exists and is a commercial building today. The high school was built on Leonard Avenue, and this became the Northfield High School. Still again looking much like it was today. Further up Old 8 was the Presbyterian Church, built on the site of what we now know as the library. This church was the third church on the site. The first was the rather warehousing-looking building that we saw at the cheese factory. That served up until 1871. Another building was built in 1871, burning in 1891, and replaced by this structure. This structure remained as part of the Presbyterian Church until it merged with the Federated Church in 1954 and eventually was torn down for the site of the library. Across the street from the library that we know today and across the pond are some early houses that can be still seen in that area. Further up on Old 8 was the Cartwright home. And further up towards the intersection of Valley View and Old 8, we see the beginnings of the Macedonia Northfield Cemetery. That's Valley View Road that you see in the foreground, and it sits quite a ways back from the existing corner. That was added later as the cemetery expanded. This was the Graham House at that intersection of Valley View and Old 8. It was the original William Lemon homestead, settled in 1830. About that time, Indian squatters occupied this land and had to be paid to leave by the early settlers. This was part of that corner we know as Graham's Corner when it was used as a gas station. And then looking back down Old 8, we see that traffic has increased rather significantly, as one car can be seen here. We are looking back towards Northfield Center. Continuing north on Old 8 is the old Cyrus Eaton home as we know it. Originally it was the John Wilson home. It was the lot south of the Fell lot. It was really lot number 84 of the old township. The original Fell residence, which later succumbed to fire and was never rebuilt, only a small cottage was built there, and an early view of a scene at Fell Lake. This would be another view in Northfield Center. This would be at the border of what we now know as Macedonia and Northfield Center. This was the Lemon Farm. This was the last structure on the line between Northfield and Macedonia on the north side of the road. Some other early views of Northfield Center. This was the Eleanor Block, which was built early in the 1920s. It had several sections added to it, was used for a variety of things. A post office was there from 1934 to 1955 before moving down to Leonard Avenue. Perhaps some of you may remember the fire that raced through the Eleanor Block in 1972, starting in the basement of the paint store in the corner. Moving a little bit to the south, in that area that we knew as Little York, this was Becky's Tavern. Some of you may remember it. It was very active as a social club during Prohibition. It also served as a skating rink and burned down in the 1970s. It is now the site of a small apartment complex. Little York was established around 1825 when a sawmill was built along Brandywine Creek. Eventually, Little York had a frame school built in 1854. It was District Number 6. And you can see the tracks of the interurban running alongside the school. And of course, there was Welcome Field, the private aviation field, started in 1948. It was part of the Oviatt Farm and Homestead, and now has become site for new housing. And one of Northfield's most well-known old houses on Twinsburg Road was the old Walcott Homestead. And today you recognize this as the homestead at Need's Garden Center. It's difficult to include shots of all the people from early Northfield, but this would be typical of some of the scenes during those early days, like this 1912 photo of the students in front of the one-room schoolhouse. Or this photo of Earl Peck, who delivered mail throughout the community for many years with his mule cart. Or also this proud catch being displayed by three of our residents, Frank and Laverne Wise and Frank Jenkins. And also there was the Bliss Band that was very, very familiar here in the community. This photo from about 1900, but the Bliss Band traced its beginnings back to 1846. And then there are more modern views, of course, such as the Memorial Day Parade, an annual event looked forward to by all of our local residents. Let's move on to the second community of Old Northfield, and that is Sagamore Hills. We'll first stop at Brandywine Falls. Actually, the portion west of Brandywine Road and north of Stanford Road is part of Sagamore Hills. The other side is part of Northfield Center. As we said earlier, the area to the south of Brandywine Creek was annexed from Boston in 1819. Let's get our bearings straight here for a few moments as we look at this early photo. In 1814, George Wallace moved here from Cleveland, where he had a cabin at Bank and Superior Streets. He felt like the malaria-like atmosphere in Cleveland was just too much to bear and wanted to move out to the country. He first built a sawmill on the north side of the road and on the north side of the creek. And then in 1815 built this grist mill on the south side, which was active up until about 1890. Shortly thereafter, he built a cabin on the north side near the site of the current homestead. In 1816, a distillery was built on the south side where corn was used as mash to create, quote, excellent whiskey, as early records would have us remember, and that was active until about 1830. About 1821, a woolen mill was also built on the south side. So Brandywine really became quite a center of commerce and industry. And it is said that early Brandywine had more people and more businesses than downtown Cleveland. We should also mention that a log school was built here at Brandywine in 1817 at about where the point I-271 now crosses Brandywine Road. This early bridge was eventually replaced by another bridge, seen here crossing Brandywine Creek. Still later by another bridge, which is the current walkway at the scenic area at Brandywine Falls. And of course the road of Brandywine Road as we know it today. Let's look at the grist mill that was built here in 1815. There was a diversion dam built across the creek so that the water would be diverted from the creek to the inside of the mill building and work its way down to the mill wheel. If you look carefully at the opening at the bottom of the building, you can see the mill wheel that was used for turning the grist wheels. John Minot was the miller here at the mill, and it is said that it was he that gave Brandywine its name. If you look carefully today, you can still see the area chiseled in stone where that diversion dam was built. Until 1843, the mills worked very efficiently. But then in 1843, a very serious flood destroyed virtually everything at Brandywine. The old sawmill was totally destroyed, but pieces of it were picked up and moved to Macedonia, behind where we know Watson's lumberyard is today. The grist mill was rebuilt and was used until about 1900, grinding flour, cornmeal, and horse feed for the community. The woolen mill was never replaced. The grist mill was struck by lightning in 1920 and destroyed, and on its site, Mr. Hale moved the Hale Electric Company and built this factory for manufacturing of his restaurant supplies. This too was struck by lightning and destroyed in 1937. And if you look carefully, the foundation can still be seen along the banks of the falls. He moved his operation to a building behind the Wallace House, which later became the welding shop of Ben Richards. Old Brandywine Falls is indeed a scenic beauty. There are days when it is simply a simple trickle, and there are other days when thousands of gallons of water rush over to almost a deafening roar. Its surface has been worn smooth by years of water rushing over the falls. But as we said earlier, if you look closely, you can still see the area where the diversion dam existed. And of course, how many of us have gone down to take a look at the rather exciting ice formations that are formed there during the wintertime. Brandywine Falls area always offers some exciting views, whether it be in the fall, winter, spring, or summer. Looking across from the falls, we see the Wallace House, which of course today has been restored as a bed and breakfast and run by innkeepers George and Katie Hoy. Over the mantel stands a picture of George Wallace, who once lived in the house. And almost on any given day, the innkeeper can be seen working around the area. George Hoy, among his many other talents, is also a very talented artist. Picking up our story of Old Brandywine, a variety of other buildings were built in the area. In 1825, a post office was built and operated until 1855. George Wallace was the postmaster. In 1830, a frame school was built. This is the remnants of that building. It was later used by William Somers, the well-known artist, who used it for his art studio. It was on the west side of Brandywine, about where I-271 crosses, and eventually was moved out of the area and actually destroyed when I-271 was built. In 1854, the Upper Brandywine School was built. It was a frame school built on the east side of the road, south of the railroad tracks. A little further up on Brandywine Road was the Huddleston farm. Some other sites from early history was, of course, the Jate Mill that ran for many years at the bottom of Highland Road, near what we now know as the Redlock area. By 1827, that canal was operating and gave a new means of moving goods out of the area. Remnants of that canal can still be seen. Here is where the water is being diverted under the high bridge on Route 82 between Brecksville and Cleveland. And you can see the falls at the river adjacent to where the water is being diverted into the canal. There are still remnants of the canal in many locations that can be seen, especially after rainfall, where it begins to fill up a little bit more. And of course, many locks still exist, this one being the lock between Highland Road and 82, known as 18 Mile Lock. But it really was the railroad that signaled the demise for the canal and transportation using the canal packets. They were somewhat slow and limited in the amount of goods they could carry, and hence the railroad filled that void. This is a shot of the trestle that crossed over the valley before it was demolished. And the early railroad tracks, built about 1855, north of the high bridge that we now know that crosses 82 between the Brecksville and Sagamore border. Of course, many of us have rather recent memories of the steam line that ran down through the valley and could still hear the shrill of the whistle as it made its way under the bridge, as it made its crossing of old Route 82 at the bottom of the hill. The Cuyahoga was crossed by an old cast iron bridge between Sagamore and Brecksville. This was cast iron, not steel. And of course, it has now been restored by the Park Service and open to pedestrian traffic only. The original bridge had wooden blocks or wooden bricks as its base. And of course, it was eventually covered by tar as cars made their way across it. It was used by vehicular traffic until about 1976. The High Bridge on 82 was opened in 1933. Again, not a great deal of traffic can be seen here. It was a graceful 5-arch span. And many of you remember construction in 1989 when the bridge decking and most of its superstructure was refurbished. And then the grand opening on a bitterly cold day to allow traffic to go back across again. But the bridge still is a beautiful sight when looked at from the bottom of the Piney Narrows, as it was known. And the Cuyahoga in that area is still a very appealing area for local canoe enthusiasts. As we continue our stops throughout the community, of course, there was the Marshall Mansion. There was the old, what was known as the West School at Route 82, the northeast corner of Carter Road. It served as the number 3 district school from 1881 to 1918. It was then sold and moved to Chaffee Road and was used as a house later on. This school replaced a stone school on the same site. It had been used from 1826 to 1881. And that stone school was later moved to the Bishop Home on Valley View, where it was reassembled. This was the Snatchpenny School, one of the frame schools of 1854. It was District Number 4 school and was on Dunham Road at the entry to Willow Lake. It replaced an earlier log school on Valley View about 1/2 mile west of the cemetery, which had been built in 1818. We should also mention that prior to 1817, school was held in the Rowley House, which later became the Rainier Farm, as it's seen today, located on Valley View. Some other interesting houses of the community were the Nesbitt House on Nesbitt Road, the Stone House, which can be seen in the back, was built first in 1826, where the family lived until the frame house was completed. And of course, the McKisson House, famous for the 1837 murder mystery. Let's move on to Macedonia, where Henry Woods discovered the area around the Indian Creek settlement when he made an expedition from Snatchpenny about 1819. He discovered the area to be very appealing and brought back information to others. With that, Abraham Kramer built the first log house at the corners on Jenkins Road in about 1825. Early Macedonia still is about as it is today, with the roads quite similar to where they are today. If we look to the east, this was the Free Will Baptist Church built in 1835. We are looking from the junction of Valley View, which runs to the south, and this would be 82 running to the east. On that site, in front of that, was eventually built the Macedonia City Hall, or Town Hall, which is today used as a private business. The area to the right was used as the first fire station. This very early view of the corners at Macedonia. Route 82 is running east and west across the center of the picture. Valley View Road to Hudson goes off to the southeast. Little York Road to the south, which runs to the west of Indian Run in this picture. We would be looking basically to the northwest, as if we were standing on the corner where the tire store currently sits at the corners. In 1833, a log school was built on Valley View, just short of this location. In 1851, Cleveland and the Pittsburgh Railroad came through Macedonia, and Route 82 was a grade crossing at ground level. Here we see on the south side the Riley Parkman Hotel that was later moved to the east when the crossing was elevated. About 1893, work began on raising the tracks, and we see here a work engine bringing gondola cars, dropping earth to help build up that roadway. And soon that very familiar bridge over State Road was completed, looking quite the same as it does today, with the exception of that post in the center, which if it still were there would really create some interesting traffic problems during rush hour. With the elevated railway completed, a depot would eventually be built up on the top of the railroad track area. The Munn store can be seen to the right, and we would be looking to the south in this view. The depot was built, and for many years Nelson Brown was the station master here at the depot. A little later photo, we see a fast rushing train coming from the north, headed to the south. If you look carefully to the left, you can see part of the old coal and mill buildings that were the early buildings before the Fenton Lumber Yard or the Fenton Coal Yard, and eventually the Watson Lumber Yard. In this view, we're looking to the west, and we see the early commercial buildings of Macedonia. This was part of Brooks' store, built in 1850, and was part of the commercial scene well through the early 1900s until it was torn down in 1922. This was always the scene of much activity. It was partly used as a post office and was a gathering point for the local residents to come and to exchange stories and learn what was happening in the community. There are always a few interesting pictures that come. You can see the Brooks store in the background and three early unidentified citizens sitting on a wheelbarrow. We're not exactly sure why, but they are, and they're posing for this picture. Continually, we're looking to the west. The Brooks store is on the right. The old Methodist church can be seen on the left. This was the sawmill that preceded Watson's lumber yard. This was part of that was moved from Brandywine after the floods of 1843. The block at the corner of what we now know as Freeway Drive and Route 82 was built about 1920. And then, of course, the Fenton Coal Yard was established a little further north of that intersection, and today is on the site of where Watson's Lumber Yard exists. Here we are looking at what we now know as the corner of New 8 and 82, where the interurban is stopping at the station. The interurban actually built a double track from 303 to Ledge Road in 1914, and 1916 was the last year in which the ABC ran through the center of Northfield Center. This 1928 photo shows one of the interurban cars southbound. The service ended, the interurban service ended on April 1st, 1932. That building has been used by the power company and also had several other uses, seen here as use as the sheriff's post at one time. New 8 opened in 1955, and again traffic was not a real problem in those days. This was an early view of the Methodist Church and parsonage. It succumbed to fire in 1910, and a new building was built on the same site. And of course, that church later moved to the east and is the same congregation that now meets at that new building east on Route 82. We're looking east on 82 from the railroad bridge, and we're looking at the hotel. The hotel was moved from the railroad crossing and moved to this site. It was indeed a very interesting building. There was a ballroom on the top floor. There were several outbuildings in which travelers could park their wagons and stable their horses, and a rather unique way of building a water tower, which was used to supply water for the hotel. The building was damaged and destroyed by fire, and eventually the block of stores was built on this site, where you now know that the small Macedonia post office stands in that block of stores. Another view of the outbuildings of that hotel and Indian Run. Several other views of this area in more modern times. We are looking to the west. The Sunoco gas station was later replaced by the Gastown gas station. That would help you identify where this location is. Some other early buildings, two hardware stores, probably on 82, and this blacksmith shop probably just around the corner on Valley View. We mentioned earlier that the brick school was built in both Macedonia and in Northfield. They were twin red brick schools, identical for both Northfield and Macedonia. Each had to be equal. Equality prevailed. It was built in 1879 and replaced a frame schoolhouse which was adjacent to it. You can see the remnants of that building to the right of the picture. It was built in 1854, and when it was abandoned in 1880, it was sold to a non-profit organization and was known simply as the Hall. The brick school was torn down in 1927 for the other brick school. Here's an early school bus for the school district. The photo is from 1920. The school bus seats approximately 24 youngsters, but obviously it's politically incorrect, for neither the bus nor the horses were painted yellow, and obviously the horses did not have taillights. The 1927 brick school, which can still be recognized today. We finish our trip around the four communities with a stop in Northfield Village. This was the Old North School on Ledge, east of the old former gas station at the corner of Route 8 and Ledge Road, built in 1854 as the number 7 district schoolhouse. It closed in 1903 and was later used as a private residence. Here we see school buses lined up on Old Route 8 or Northfield Road. Frank Kamilovic rented them to the school district in the 1920s and 1930s. and provided drivers for them. Here we can also see part of the interurban track along Northfield Road before it was removed. Some other early scenes in Northfield Village was the original Baptist church, which today has been renovated and is still active as an active congregation. Sportsman's Park began life in 1931 as a dog track, but only lasted for a very short time until it became used for auto races and other shows. In 1948 to 1955, it was home to stock car races, and in 1959, a new grandstand was erected and harness racing began. The Northfield Village Town Hall began early 1950s with only the basement being built and the adjacent fire station. The village town hall was completed with revenues from the harness racing track about 1959 or 1960. Of course, some of you still remember the Star Drive-In that disappeared not so long ago on Northfield Road, and some of the other earlier businesses that were located throughout the area. Perhaps one of the more famous locations in Northfield Village was the City Ice and Fuel Company of Cleveland horse farm. This was the house on the farm. These were the barns and stables where the Ice and Fuel Company sent their horses that dragged their wagons around Cleveland out to this location where they could rest, relax, and have a little bit of free time. The house was later used by the Cleveland Abrasive Company, and the barn became a factory. And of course, the shopping plaza eventually became the occupant of that site in 1961. We can't finish this program without a short commercial from the Historical Society and a few words about the Palmer House. The Palmer House was built in 1844, a classical Western Reserve architectural style, and it was the second house built in the center. It originally stood a little closer to the south, but had to be moved northwards in 1915 when the brick schoolhouse was built in the center. Its unique construction has vertical beams inside, and the interior walls are made of random width chestnut, 18 to 30 inches in width and about 3 inches thick. It is home to the Historical Society's historical collection, and indeed we invite you to come and see those artifacts which have been displayed within. The Palmer House also has other artifacts from the area, including this wheel from the old mill at Brandywine, this old stone trough from the Long Estate, and always old-fashioned gardens with interesting flowers. And finally, as we look through our window, we see one other thing, and that is change. It is not much different here than anywhere else across the lands of the Western Reserve. Change is a fact of life these days, sometimes hard to accept, but indeed, change occurs. But when the world seems to rush by without any meaning, when everything seems to look like a big blur, do as our friend here at All Saints Cemetery and stop. Take time to look around the countryside and reflect on the heritage of our town. Take a little time to recharge your batteries. Take a walk in the woods. Watch our beavers swim and build their dams. Take a train ride. Smell the flowers. Enjoy a sunset. and reflect on what life was like here generations ago. And then maybe look again through our window with a new perspective at the people, the places, and things of that place we call our home. Town 5, Range 11, Old Northfield.